Good day, everybody. I hope that you're well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 3 English lesson on adjectives and adverbs. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts, grade 3. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of adjectives and adverbs. All right, so our chapter is adjectives and adverbs. Our subject is English Language Arts. We're doing grade 3. And in the lessons that we are going to be doing today, under the chapter of adjectives and adverbs, is to choose between adjectives and adverbs, and the other lesson will be, is the word an adjective or an adverb? So that is going to be our lessons for today. And before we are able to even answer those questions, before we even able to choose between an adjective and an adverb, right? Then it means that we need to know what an adjective is and we need to know what an adverb is. All right. So an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun. And usually when it comes to adjectives, right? And then adjectives, they either tell us, like I say, about the noun or describes the noun, or we can even say it modifies the noun. With adjectives, they either ask us things like what kind or how many. So if you are to identify an adjective within a, let's say within a sentence, then you need to ask yourself like what kind, or you need to ask yourself how many, right? And then you'll be able to answer the question if it tells us either what kind or if it tells us how many. And if it tells us how many, then it doesn't necessarily just have to be a number like one to whatever number, right? If we, for example, say how many, then it can even be things like saying, it can even be like words like several, many, much. Um, those are but an example or a few examples of adjectives that either tell us how many. Then they can even be adjectives that tells us what kind. And adjectives that tells us what kind can either be in the form of, it can be in the form of height, can be in the form of color, can be in the form of weight, um, maybe size. Um, it can be anything, but you need to basically answer the question of what kind of whatever that he has. And it tells us about the noun. So you need to basically ask that question based on the noun. And if we look at an example of an adjective, remember we said that adjectives, it either tells us what kind or it tells us how many. And if we look at examples of adjectives, and then we can either say that firstly, an adjective, it's a word that tells us about the noun. Like I say, it tells you about the noun. We can say it modifies a noun, or we can say it describes the noun. It's really up to, it depends on the sentence, right? And then we said adjectives, it either tells us what kind or it tells us how many. And if we look at these two sentences, right, of adjectives, one that will either tell us how many, and the other one that will tell us what kind, right? Yeah, it says Jody saw three stars in the sky. So Jody saw three skies in the sky. So now you need to ask yourself, how many stars did Jody see? And now it will show that Jody saw three stars in the sky, right? Which means that this sentence, it basically tells us how many stars Jody saw. And the question was basically answered. It is three stars, right? Some, like I said, you can even use words like many, you can use words like lots, you can use words like several, you can use words like few. Those are also words that tells us how many. It doesn't necessarily have to be a direct number. Then we have an adverb, right? And an adverb, it is a word that tells us about the verb. So an adverb tells us about the verb. And adverbs, they often tell us how, when, or they tell you when, where. So adverbs, they often tell you how, when, or where. And if we look at an example of adverbs, right, it says Grace ran quickly. So Grace ran quickly. And if we were to answer the question, right, usually when there's a question, let's say when it answers the question of how, then our adjective needs to end with an ly. So if the adverbs tell us how, so if the adverbs tell us how, and then it means that it ends with, then it means that our adverb is going to end in ly. And if we look at the sentence, it says Grace ran quickly. So Grace ran quickly, which means that quickly is our adjective, right? Because it tells us how Grace ran. So how did Grace run? Quickly. And it also ends in ly. All right. So far that is the difference between an adjective and that is the difference between an adverb, right? And remember we said we had to choose between an adjective and we had to choose between an adverb. So that is going to be our first lesson under the chapter of adjective and adverb. All right. So that is basically the difference between an adjective and the difference between an adverb, right? And once again, we said an adjective is a word that tells us about the noun, and adjectives that often tell us either what kind or they can tell us how many, right? So they can either tell us what kind, can either tell us what kind of dress. It can be a red dress, it can be a long dress, summer dress, short dress, or it can be how many, right? It can be five, it can be many, it can be several, it can be few. And keep in mind an adverb, right? The word verb is basically an adverb, right? Which means that a adverb tells us more about the verb, right? And when it comes to adverbs, they often tell us either how, they tell us when, or they tell us where. And remember, we said that with adverbs, right? If an adverb ends or tells us how, if an adverb tells us how, All right. And once again, if you like with adverbs, if it basically tells us, if it often tells you how, and then it means that it will either end with a ly. The word that tells us how someone does something. All right, so let us go to aplusstudents.ca, and that is where we're going to do a tutorial and then go over our tests. And we said that we are doing the first chapter, which is to choose between an adjective and to choose between an adverb. And we said an adjective is a word that tells us more about the noun. And adjectives, they often either tell us what kind or they tell us how many. For example, Jody saw 3 stars in the sky. And that means that that tells us how many stars Jody see. And then we have the adverb that is a word that tells us more about the verb. And adverbs often tell us how, when, where. And then if we look at an example, it says Grace ran quickly. And as you can see, quickly is in bold because now it means that quickly is our adverb because it tells us how Grace ran. She ran quickly. And most of our verbs that tell us how, they often end in ly, like quickly, hurriedly, right? That is but just 2 examples. Sadly. And then as much as the adjective or most of the adjective will end in ly, right? That is adjective that tells us how. But you can't always just use ly to tell whether a word is in an adjective or if it is an adverb, though. For example, she arrives soon. She arrives soon. And we see that not all of our adverbs they end with ly, right? For example, she arrives soon, right? So soon is then our adverb. It doesn't end in ly, right? And then another one says Fred has a friendly dog, right? And this one describes the dog, which means that it's an adjective. If something describes either a person, an animal, place, or thing, and then it means that that is an adjective, right? But words like soon, that is an adverb. All right, so we are now going to insert the correct missing verb within the sentence. It says, So it says, please sweep the porch this afternoon. But now, if we were to add our adverb, and then we can just say, please sweep the dirty porch this afternoon. Because it means that the porch is dirty, it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be washed up. And dirty basically tells us how or what the porch is, or how the porch is, right? So dirty basically tells us how the Porsche is. And yet is the word Porsche is a noun. Remember, as much as they say the adverb, the verb, right? But we also need to look at the noun, what the word that is being described, or the word that is being identified. Like for example, a Porsche. A Porsche is not a verb, which means that it is a noun. And the word that comes in front of the word Porsche, right, will then be an adjective that will tell us more about the noun. So we won't say dirtily because then that's an adverb. So all we say is that the dirty Porsche, because we are describing the Porsche. What kind of Porsche is it? It's a dirty Porsche. All right. Okay, so before we go on to our test, it says, will Mrs. Marshall be driving to work at the usual time? If we say usual time, right? So we will say at the usual time. So usual will be added before time. All right. And then they say the beach can be a good summer vacation spot. All right, let's go to our test where we are going to either choose between an adjective or we're going to choose between an adverb. Remember, an adjective tells us more about the noun, whereas an adverb tells us more about the verb. So we either going to choose an adjective or we're going to choose an adverb. So it says, Mrs. Pittman, do we say Mrs. Pittman carefully lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf, or do we say Mrs. Pittman careful lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf? Remember, we need to also look at what is being, let's say, described. Is it either the noun or is it a verb? So Mrs. Pittman, do we say carefully lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf, or careful lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf? All right, so if we were to choose the correct one, then we would then say Mrs. Pittman carefully, yes, option one is correct. Carefully lifted the glass bowl onto the shelf. And if you look at this word, lifted, right, that is a verb, right, which means that carefully is an adverb that tells us about the verb. All right, and option one is correct. Well done. It says Kathy or Katie and Sandra. Do we say neat packed or neatly packed their clothes for their vacation in Arizona? So it says Kathy and Sandra. Do we say Kathy and Sandra neat packed their clothes for their vacation in Arizona? Or do we say neatly? Kathy and Sandra neatly packed their clothes for the vacation in Arizona. All right, so it says Kathy and Sandra. We will say they neatly packed their clothes for the vacation in Arizona. And the reason why it's also neatly, because if you look at that word packed, right? Packed is something that you do, right? Which means that it is a verb. So neatly packed is an adverb that tells us about the verb. Option two. And option two is correct. So well done. It says, will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the, do we say at the usually time or do we say at the usual time? So will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the, do we say usually time or do we say usual time? So we need to either say, is it will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the usually time or at the usual time? Usual time or usually time? All right, so we will say, will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the, let's say, at the usual time. So at the usual time is option two, which we will then basically, so that is then a adjective that is then being chosen over there, right? Usual time. All right, then it says my father's, do we say my father's fresh bread or my father's freshly bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup? My father's fresh bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup, or my father's freshly bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup. So, do we say my father's fresh bread or my father's freshly bread? So do we say my father's fresh bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup, or do we say my father's freshly bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup? Which one is the correct answer? All right, and if we were to choose the correct one, we would say my father's fresh bread tasted delicious with homemade soup. So well done. Fresh is correct. So well done. So now we're going into the next lesson, which is the word an adjective or an adverb? This is not us identifying whether it is an adjective or whether it is an adverb. So Nina eagerly waits for a reply about the job. So Nina eagerly waits for a reply about the job. We need to say if that is an adverb or an adjective. Adverb or an adjective. Eagerly. Is eagerly an adjective or an adverb? So Nina eagerly waits for a reply about the job. Do we say it's an adverb? Eagerly, is it an adverb or is it an adjective? Eagerly. And if we were to identify whether it is an adverb or an adjective, then yes, we will say eagerly is an adverb, right? Because waits is a verb, which means that eagerly is, it tells us about the verb. Then it says, he never exercises and he is in terrible shape. Is that an adjective or an adverb? He never exercises and is in terrible shape. All right. And then it says, Russell reads quietly for hours in his cozy bed. If you look at the word quietly, is quietly an adjective or is it an adverb? So Russell reads quietly for hours in his cozy bed. And if we look at that sentence, right, then if we were to underline, identify the underlined word, and then we would say that's an adverb, and the adverb is quietly, because it tells us how she's going to or what she's going to do. Right? So quietly is an adverb, and it talks about her reading quietly. All right, let's go to the test where we are going to say is the word an adverb or an adjective. So, the sudden storm brought the outdoor event to an end. So, the sudden storm brought the outdoor event to an end. Is this an adjective or an adverb? All right, so do we say it's an adjective or an adverb? And that is sudden. All right, so if we were to choose the correct one, then we would say the sudden storm. So, sudden storm. So, half of you are saying adverbs, some are saying adjective, right? And it is an adjective. So, storm is it's a noun, right? Which means that we had to then choose an adjective to describe the storm. All right, the woman quickly grabbed a sandwich after work. The woman quickly grabbed a sandwich after work. So the word quickly, is it an adjective? All right, so quickly, right? Remember quickly? How did they grab something? Grab is an action that is being done, which means that the word quickly will then be an adverb, right? Which tells us it's almost like the action that is being described. So we can say it is an adverb. So quickly, and it tells us how it is being grabbed. So well done. Yes, an adverb is correct. Well done. The sad little puppy was happy to be rescued. The sad little puppy was happy to be rescued. So the word sad, is that an adjective or is it an adverb? So sad little puppy. Look at the word sad, right? What is the word afterwards? Is little. And then we have puppy, right? So which means that they are describing the puppy. And if they're describing the puppy, they're saying this puppy is sad and little, right? Which means that this is in an adjective because they are describing the puppy, which is a noun. Because remember, if you describe someone or something, you can say, "Oh, you are so happy and beautiful, happy and beautiful." So there's two words that would be describing that noun. And they described the puppy as sad and little, right? That is how the puppy is being described, sad and little. All right. Then it says Tyler reads quietly for hours in his cozy bed. So Tyler reads quietly for hours in his cozy bed. Quietly. Is that an adjective or is it an adverb? Quietly. Quietly. Reads. Is reads a noun or is reads a verb? And quietly is, it will tell us, it's an adverb, right? That tells us how he or she is reading, right? So an adverb it is. All right, an adverb it is. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs, right? We see that an adjective is a word that either tells us about the noun, we said it can describe a noun, or it can modify a noun, right? That's an adjective. And also, we said adjectives, they can either answer questions like what kind or how many, right? And then we also have identified adjectives or adverbs within sentences, right? Because with adverbs, right, they often tell us how. All right, so this is the end of our lesson, grade 3. Thank you very much for joining our class. I really hope that you have some form of understanding of what an adjective and an adverb is. Remember, an adjective, it describes the noun or tells us about the noun, whereas an adverb, it tells us more about a verb. All right, so have a good evening further. Goodbye.